of you who have joined us for the past many sessions. This is our third and final session for Understanding Israel. Just by a show of hands, has anyone here joined us for all three? Oh, terrific, terrific, terrific. So the first conversation we had was a general conversation about the conflict as it was raging in Israel and Gaza. The second conversation was a beautiful dialogue between Israelis and a Palestinian woman and some of the groundbreaking work they're doing through cultural exchanges and other things. And maybe now is a good time to introduce tonight's conversation. I am so excited for what we're going to be discussing tonight. Jonathan and I have been in touch weeks, maybe even longer ago, to talk about Iran and Iran's regional aspirations, what role Iran plays that is not, as Rabbi Lustig mentioned just briefly a moment ago, which is not often talked about. Before we jump into our conversation, I want to take a moment and introduce our speaker tonight. Jonathan Schanzer. He is a senior vice president for research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. He's also on the leadership team at their Center for Economics and Financial Power. Jonathan previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the Department of Treasury and also researcher for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and Middle East Forum. Jonathan has written hundreds of articles, including and as well 3 groundbreaking books on Palestinian politics, on regional terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda. He has spent much of today, for those of you who missed the earlier part of this conversation, Jonathan has spent much of today on the news. In fact, at least one of our participants this evening has already seen Jonathan on the news. So Jonathan, you are already a known and loved entity here in our Washington Hebrew community. So I want to thank you, Jonathan, for joining us and being a part of this larger conversation about what's happening today. I know Rabbi Lustig has a burning question we're going to start with, and also on a larger level, what we can come to expect for the Middle East moving forward, specifically as it pertains to Iran and some of the instability that has come from its regional aspirations. But before we do, I am going to we have a civility pledge, and I want to take a moment and just pull that up. I apologize. This civility pledge has helped guide our conversations as a congregational community. Every time we talk about things like Israel, things that come with a lot of different opinions. And it's not just the opinions that matter to us, but of course how we relate to each other, understand each other, and remain committed to learning from each other in these important congregational moments. So I'm going to ask Roberta. Roberta, are you able to see the screen that I've shared?
Yes.
Roberta, can I ask you to read this pledge as someone who's been such a wonderful participant in these conversations so far?
We pledge to guard our tongues, showing care for the dignity of every human being, even those with whom we may strongly disagree. We will listen carefully when others speak, seeking to understand what is being said and trying to learn from it. We pledge that these discussions will remain welcoming to all. Amen.
Thank you. Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Roberta. So we're going to begin our conversation with Jonathan Schanzer, and I know Rabbi Lustig, I want to give you the first question here because there's so much happening right now.
First of all, I don't want to preempt what Jonathan has to say with peppering too many questions. But I just think that this is, we're so appreciative. And when we talked about this in terms of came up with this topic, when we issued the idea of policy predicament and the promise, we were in the middle of a raging situation. What was important, and the reason we put not knowing what was going to happen, although the timing of this is pretty remarkable, we know that we wanted to have a speaker like Jonathan because You can change who lives in a particular house in the neighborhood, but you're not going to change the neighborhood. And Israel may be changing its leadership at a particular time, but I think it's very important for us to have perspective and understand what is going on and what role has been played by Iran over the last decade and even more in being a puppet master in some cases, being a catalyst, being a funder, being this way. And it is often in the concepts that we hear about on the news, and I'm sure Jonathan will illuminate this, it is the untold story. It is the story that we tend to grab headlines of what happens today, and we seldom go deep enough to ask why and what is the geopolitical, the religious, the historical that is driving sort of these things. And in the area, we're making a change of government in Israel now after a long stretch, almost 13 years of Netanyahu, but consistent in his reign and even before them has been a struggle in the Middle East for power and who will hold hegemony in many ways, and especially in the Arab world. And so we look forward to it. So, Jonathan, I'll just, if you can give us some of the background in terms of us helping understand the larger picture. And also, I'm sure you'll delve into how this dramatic change in Israel might or might not affect what's going on. But thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So you've kind of kicked this off with a big question. I'll try to provide enough of a background to kind of get us started, and then I'm very happy to answer questions and follow up. What I would say is that the modern nation of Iran was initially not an enemy of Israel. There are actually some remarkable photos of Iran before the 1979 revolution, where, for example, Ezra Weitzman, the former president of Israel, who was a fighter pilot, flew all the way to Iran and was met on the tarmac by the Shah. And you see these photos, and it makes you just to sort of wonder what life would have been like had there not been a revolution. Now, the revolution is key to understanding everything. That basically in 1979, the Shah became ill, left the country, and that is when a group of Islamist revolutionaries took over the country. The guy that took it over first, his name was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and his view of the world was that it was Islam versus the West. It was Islam versus America. It was Islam versus all of the kind of Western ideologies and the structures that exist today. Our rules-based world order was an enemy of Islam. And it was kind of remarkable because they obviously, if you probably remember, they kidnapped American hostages at the US Embassy and held them for 444 days. They wreaked havoc in the skies with hijackings and other acts of terrorism. They picked wars with some of the region's nastiest foes. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 was one of the more brutal wars we've ever seen in the Middle East. And as we all know, the Middle East is full of brutal wars. And so, this has been a blight upon the region. The Islamic Republic of Iran since 1979 has been the foremost state sponsor of terrorism. It has been the number one provocateur of wars around the region. It's been the country that has sowed the most unrest around the region. And I can tell you that it has been a challenge for the region to try to contain it. And it's also been a challenge for the United States to contain it. For Israel, the proxies that Iran supports include Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Three of Israel's worst terrorist enemies, all funded by Iran. If you go further out into the region, you'll see that the Assad regime, which is responsible for killing hundreds of thousands, is sponsored by Iran. The Houthi group in Yemen, which has been firing rockets into Saudi Arabia, sponsored by Iran. think you're starting to get a picture here that Iran would like to create total chaos in the region, would like to create unrest in the region. And here's the thing, it has a goal. The rulers of Iran, remember when the Persian Empire ruled the Middle East. And they would very much like to see those days return again. And so they are believers in history, they are believers in their own religion, and they think that the two of those combined will ultimately lead to a system that brings down the influence of the United States, brings down the very country of Israel, and leaves them holding the vast majority of power and wealth across the Middle East. And it's for this reason that many of us in the policy community are opposed to a nuclear deal with Iran, knowing that we're going to be giving them more money and potentially more legitimacy in exchange for concessions that may be fleeting at best, or at worst, it could be a ruse on the part of the regime to take America's money or to take the West's money and to continue to pursue all these malign behaviors that I've just described. I hope that kind of sums it up, but that's the overview.
And a terrific overview, and a picture when so much news coverage is on Hamas rockets and Israeli fighter jets, that there is this larger narrative of regional instability that Iran is fomenting in different kinds of ways for different reasons. Jonathan, you mentioned 2 or 3 different enemies that Iran is facing, and I'm wondering if you can spend a little bit of time talking about each one. Our conversation tonight is about Israel, and I'm curious, on the one hand, how Iran sees Israel as its regional enemy. I'm also wondering how Iran sees the United States as a global opposition to its regional aspirations. And then lastly, I'm wondering about Saudi Arabia and the Sunni world that has united with Israel in these ways that I think deserves a much bigger conversation. But if you could talk about those 3 and give us a little bit of insight.
Sure. I mean, look, the first thing is how Iran views Israel and the United States. The way that the Iranian regime has long described these two countries is that America is the great Satan and Israel is the little Satan, that they are 2 parts of the same entity. They're both part of an enemy axis, if you will, and they would seek the destruction of both. Of course, they don't believe that America will be easily destroyed. We dominate them in pretty much every facet of military competition. It would be a fool's errand for them to even try. But with Israel, Israel's a small country, and it also is in their region. And what Iran does is it sponsors these proxy groups, including Hamas, as we just saw, to wage war against Israel, and to do it one step removed. So in other words, Iran puts itself in far less danger, at least historically that's been the case, by using a third party to attack Israel. And so when we see these conflicts erupt around the region, you've got to remember that, yes, there is such thing as Palestinian nationalism. I don't deny that that exists. Of course it exists, right? We have Palestinian people. It's, 5 or 8 million people that would like to have a country of their own, and they believe that it should be in the land of Israel. But they get a lot of help, and they get a lot of training. They get weapons, they get cash, and typically speaking, for the last 20 some years, it has primarily come from Iran. So when you see rockets flying in Gaza, as we did a week and a half ago, it's really hard to describe the conversation as just a war between Hamas and Israel. That it's actually a war between Hamas and Israel, sponsored by Iran. All of the fighters were trained in Iran. The cash that that Hamas uses to buy its weapons and to keep itself sustained in the Gaza Strip comes from Iran. The rockets are made with the help of Iranian engineers, so that the people are taught how to do it themselves, or in some cases, the rockets come entirely packaged and put together through a complex smuggling ring that enters into the Gaza Strip that Israel and Egypt have actually been trying to stop. The same goes for Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You probably saw that group mentioned during the last war. They are actually more directly under the thumb of Iran, but they are smaller. But whenever Hamas begins firing rockets in Israel, Palestinian Islamic Jihad will join the fight, and they will do so at the direction of Iran. And then finally, Hezbollah, which I would say is the crown jewel of Iran's terrorist network. This is an organization that has 150,000 rockets right now facing south of Israel. Just to put that in perspective, there were about 4,000 rockets fired at Israel during the latest Hamas conflict. Now think about what 150,000 of those rockets would do. Some of those are very precise rockets. Some of them have very large payloads. What Iran has been doing is basically turning a terrorist non-state actor into one of the largest armies in the Middle East, in preparation for a war with Israel, where rockets would rain down on Israel day and night for potentially months on end. And this is Iran's goal. They want to create these very destructive entities and arm them and prepare them for a war that Iran will not itself fight. Now, a postscript to this, just one last thing to note, and this has been really interesting, is that Israel sees this, of course. They've got terrific intelligence. They understand what's going on in the region. And over the last couple of years, it started under Trump, but it certainly has not ended under Biden. The Israelis have decided to start taking it to the Iranians directly. And so you've probably seen reports of cyber attacks that have destroyed certain infrastructure in Iran. I'm not going to tell you that it was Israel, but I'm not going to tell you it wasn't Israel. You probably saw even today, there was a ship that blew up in the Gulf of Oman, in the Persian Gulf. No one took responsibility for it, but I'm pretty sure it was Israel. And so what Israel has been doing, it's something that we call the war between wars. This is what Israel has named it. And they have decided that they're not going to take it anymore. They're not going to keep taking it on the chin from Iran. And that when things happen in Gaza, like we just saw, there will be retribution. And this is the new quiet shadow war that has to be understood when looking at the unrest in the Middle East and all of the ups and downs of the news cycle. You have to understand Iran's role in it if you're going to understand what's happening around the region.
One of the things that strikes me about, I think that's an excellent analysis. And what I heard in the very beginning and throughout your description is religious language. I mean, to talk about a big Satan and a little Satan, we're now leaving the world of politics and entering into the world of religion. And I'm wondering if you can help describe, for those who might not be overly familiar with, the religious tensions between Iran and maybe its Sunni neighbors, and what role Israel might play in that.
So yeah, I know you asked that the last time and I went long. So my
apologies. This is great.
So yeah, I mean, I would say that in the Muslim world, the only people more hated than Israel are if you're a Shia, it's the Sunnis. If you're a Sunni, it's the Shia. This is the sectarian split that exists within the Muslim world. It's about 80-20 or 75-25, depending on who you talk to. The Sunnis are the majority, the Shiite are the minority. And they argue about really kind of religious doctrinal things that, to me, to a somewhat secular American, I sort of scratch my head and wonder why it's such a big deal. But it really defines a huge amount of the conflict that we see in the region. And so the Sunnis hate Iran more than they hate Israel. And that was on full display in August of last year when 4 Muslim countries decided to join hands with Israel and to normalize. And basically what happened there is they looked around and they said, Israel's got the strongest military in the region. It's got the best intel in the region. It's got the best cyber capabilities in the region. And they are aligned with the Sunni world against Iran because Iran clearly wants to destroy Israel. Israel keeps taking it to the Iranians in this shadow war that I just mentioned. And they kind of said to themselves, you know what? We're done with this whole Palestinian thing. We still like the Palestinians. We still like to see a state one day if we could, maybe help make one. But we're not going to let that get in the way of the fact that we can have an alliance with the strongest actor in the region that is dedicated to combating Iran's malign activity. And so this explains the new arrangement in the Middle East. The plates are shifted. right? The sand is shifting. You get a sense that it's not the Middle East that we once knew. It doesn't mean that it's game over for Iran. It means that the Arab world, which is typically not the boldest, these are skittish countries that are more concerned with their survival. So they took the step knowing that Israel's stronger, but now they have to get comfortable with where they are and they have to think about how they want to cooperate. So we're in the process of something that is very interesting, but certainly not yet written. And a lot of it has to stem from the fact that the Sunni states and Israel both view Iran in a very negative light and would probably like to see this regime ushered out of Iran and to see something more like the Shah return.
So, if I might, Jonathan, there's a clear historical precedent of, a struggle between who's going to be king of the hill in the Arab world, and they're both political, religious, and historical parts of that, which each have their own, horse to carry you forward on, or anyway. And so I wonder if you could just give us a little insight in, just sort of the tension, because it's more than just Shiite Sunni. It is, at one time, Egypt played a central role and saw itself historically even different than most Arabs, and believed to control the pan-Arab world, and then we see that struggle now in some sense between moderate places like in the UAE, and even the role that Turkey has played and shifted. So if you could give us a little insight of that historic struggle, I think it would shed some light. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, it's a great question, Rabbi. And I would just say this, that Egypt, you're right, once saw itself as the leader of the Arab world. Since the Arab Spring, since the coup and the counter coup, as they call it, it has been in dire straits politically as well as economically. It actually did have a really interesting role in this most recent conflict in Gaza. They took a leading role in brokering the ceasefire, got very little credit for it. In fact, it was kind of remarkable to see President Biden take the credit for having, he said they made 80 phone calls from the White House and they were working around the clock. But in reality, it was actually Egypt that worked for 11 days straight to broker a ceasefire with very little help from anyone else in the region. And the Egyptians were quiet about it because they're looking to regain that foothold in the region and eventually to hopefully assume that that role of leadership. But in the meantime, there are some really interesting divisions, as you know, that have erupted in the Middle East that are really not entirely related to Iran at all. In the Sunni world, after the Arab Spring, and everybody, of course, you remember the Arab Spring, this is that moment where the Muslim Brotherhood really looked like it could take over a number of countries in the Middle East amidst a string of revolutions. And there was a lot of concern that the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, I'll just say, typically not an organization that likes to celebrate Hanukkah with Israel every year, and is not exactly considered moderate among Muslims themselves. So as this is happening, there are two countries that emerge as the champions of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that is Turkey and Qatar. Now, these are two countries that are typically viewed as American allies. I mean, Turkey is a NATO member, and Qatar has the largest air base for America in the Middle East. So these should be allies. But instead, they're out there pushing for Muslim Brotherhood governments across the region. Now, on the other side, you have what you have, I think, properly termed to be the moderate or pragmatic Sunni countries. That's the UAE and Bahrain. It's funny, it didn't used to be Saudi Arabia, but they're increasingly more moderate and pragmatic. They still have a ways to go, but they're allowing women to drive. They got rid of the religious police that would go around and whip people if they weren't dressed properly. I mean, you're seeing changes, but in general, these countries saw the Arab Spring as a destabilizing factor for the region. And what you now have is the Sunnis versus Shia, this Iran schism that we already described. And then if the Middle East wasn't complicated enough, you throw this new clash between Sunni states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Bahrainis on the one side, the Emiratis and the Turks on the other, clashing about the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in countries across the region. And by the way, the Iranians like what the Turks and the Qataris are doing, so they kind of get together and plot for ways to advance their Islamist agenda around the region. And then you've got the other Sunni states saying, no, we don't want that. And we're going to make peace with Israel because we need friends too. So you can see the entire region is shifting right now in ways that Israel could never have imagined in 1948 or 1967 or even 10 years ago. It's just all up in the air right now.
So, Jonathan, I want to follow up and just ask, what role do you think that what role is political diplomacy and what role is what I coin religious diplomacy? You go back more than 10 years and you have the Marrakesh Declaration, you have Sheikh Ben Baya and others who are promoting Sheikh Ben Baya, the leading Islamic scholar and jurisprudent, former vice president and head of the Supreme Court in Mauritania, who's brought in and is considered to be by the Muslim elders, the paramount and premier scholar who's been pushing with the Society for Promoting Peace in Muslim Society, the forum, for over a decade, this sort of moderate sort of peace in level. You have a huge shift in 2019, when you have the document of human fraternity signed by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam Al-Azhar, putting Egypt, the tension of Egypt coming back and trying to do the oldest and largest educational institution on the face of the earth. And so you have these sort of tensions pulling and whatever. How do you see, and places like Bahrain and the UAE dancing between those two worlds of political diplomacy and religious diplomacy? What do you see where the movement will be? Or, I mean, is that fair, accurate, or is it just...
Look, you raised a number of really interesting points. We have seen over the years a range of Islamic scholars come out in favor of, I wouldn't call it normalization, but I would say a recognition and a respect for Judaism and perhaps the Jewish state as well. To me, I have not seen real progress, in my view, until Saudi started to change its tune. When that began to happen, the rest of the region sort of stood up and took notice. There is a movement right now inside Saudi Arabia led by a group called the Muslim World League. The Muslim World League was responsible for spreading really hateful ideology pre 9/11, and in some ways contributed to the very toxic atmosphere that led to 9/11 in the Muslim world. And the new head of the Muslim World League, his name is Mohammed Al-Isa, and he has been on a campaign to get the Arab world, the Muslim world, to recognize the Holocaust, to understand the importance of the monotheistic faiths and their commonalities, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And so we're seeing things like that now, and they are certainly spilling over into places like the UAE and Bahrain. As you noticed, they've been there at Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, which is a center of Islamic thought for centuries. And even in places like Morocco, just a more moderate interpretation of Islam. And so it's a big change. It's sort of remarkable, but if you think about what we tried to do after 9/11, this idea of helping to create a moderate Islam as a counter to the radical versions that Al-Qaeda and others had adopted, it took about 20 years, but we're getting there now. And it's funny that that's happening, because right now you have a sense in America that we're done with the war on terror, that, we're not fighting it any longer. We need to leave Afghanistan. We need to leave Iraq. We have no business being in Syria. We need to get out of the Middle East. I mean, it's actually a bipartisan thing that both Trump and Biden have all said the same thing, probably Obama too, I guess, depending on how you read his policies. And it's all happening, this withdrawal, this decision to leave the Middle East, right as these amazing changes are occurring. And I'm not saying we should stay and fight wars forever, but I think it's worth noting right now that maybe our work did pay off, and we just weren't patient enough to see it come to fruition.
So I want to push a little bit more, because there is it's seen by the West as a tectonic, sort of shift, but it's a within the concepts of the long history of Islam, and the fact that a moderate scholar was put in charge of the Fatwa Committee, which is all of the world of Islam, including the respect of that, and that's Sheikh Ben Baya, and who has pushed this moderate thing. And so the Marrakesh document, which is already now more than a decade old, was an attempt of moving away from the traditional Western diplomacy to looking at religious diplomacy. And there's some that would, is that been effective?
It has and it hasn't. I think, to me, it seems that, again, I would just say that there have been some important advances in what you would call religious diplomacy. In my view, it has been hit and miss. It has not generated the sea change that we had hoped. But I do believe that now, with Saudi Arabia pushing for these reforms as the leader of the Muslim world, as the custodians of the two holy mosques, that these are the changes that are happening. I think some of it, by the way, is an attempt to differentiate from the radicalism that we see in Iran, or some of the radicalization that we see out of Turkey or Qatar right now. And so it's for that reason that I think we're seeing some of these changes, these shifts. And I think, that the region will be better off for it, or at least I'm hopeful at this point. And by the way, we didn't get into this yet, but the normalization that we've seen, I think it's absolutely a result of a growing respect for Jews and for Israel. And then you have tonight, which is remarkable. And we were talking about the historic moment tonight, but what you have is an Islamist party in Israel joining the ruling coalition for the first time in the country's history. I quipped on Twitter that this was the fifth normalization deal. It's obviously maybe not as significant as 4 other countries joining, but to have the even a small segment of the Arab population see the need to work closely with the Israeli government to advocate for their own interests while legitimizing the Jewish state in the process is a significant event. And it's for that reason I think that today is historic, even if Bibi somehow scuttles this this coalition deal. Even if he does find a way to torpedo the whole thing, the fact that Mansour Abbas signed on the dotted line tonight is a remarkable occurrence.
Incredible.
But even it's unbelievably remarkable. But even more remarkable, in a sense, is that the tolerance during the height of the intensity of what was going on, where the entire Muslim world was so upset about the desecration or the entering of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on so close to Eid and on the closing days of Ramadan. There were major Muslim groups that came out that, rather than attacking Israel for doing this, only spoke to the Marrakesh document, the document of human fraternity, and spoke in the sense that we should honor all sacred places, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. That is unprecedented in the universalistic response rather than a particularistic response. And that is quite remarkable. Go ahead, please. Sorry.
I want to follow up because, Jonathan, you're bringing up a fascinating conversation about normalization. And I'm wondering, to go back to the question of Iran at hand, there are religious reasons behind this. There are economic and cultural reasons behind this, to be sure. I'm wondering if you could give an overview of Iran's indirect role, but clearly role that Iran has played in bringing Israel closer to its Sunni allies. Now, I mean, the fact that we're even using the term Sunni allies is shocking to me. What has brought them specifically closer? If you can go through maybe some events that come to mind, and also, I think everybody at the end of the Trump administration was waiting for Saudi Arabia. I'm not in the Trump administration, but waiting for Saudi Arabia. We're still waiting for Saudi Arabia. And I wonder what you think it will take for Saudi Arabia, if Saudi Arabia will ever come around to join this Sunni alliance.
Sure. So I'll go through all 4 states that normalized. Morocco was a no-brainer. Morocco and Israel had gone through starts and stops for many years. And Morocco, I think, as Rabbi Lustig mentioned, already has a fairly rich history of coexistence and outreach. And, you know, it's pretty far west in North Africa. It's away from the conflict. I've been there. I was actually there on my honeymoon, and they barely speak Arabic there. It's some sort of French Arabic, I don't even know what, but I got into a whole argument with a cab driver where I thought he was refusing the fare that I wanted to give him, and he was saying okay, and we fought for 10 minutes. I mean, it doesn't feel like the rest of the Middle East to me, and so it was not a surprise. It was a surprise to nobody in Israel. Now, Sudan was a remarkable story because Sudan was a state sponsor of terrorism since, I want to say, 1991 or 1992. And they were a spot where Iran would bring weapons over to the Horn of Africa, and then those weapons would be smuggled by way of caravan up the coast into the Sinai Peninsula. From there, the Bedouin of Egypt would smuggle those rockets into the Gaza Strip, and then they'd be fired into Israel. And Israel in 2014 had reached a point where they could not deal any longer, and they actually flew into Sudan. By the way, the Israelis will never admit this to this day, but they flew fighter jets into Sudan. They used a weapon that was something like an electromagnetic pulse. It turned off all the electricity in the entire city of Khartoum, and then they proceeded to bomb Hamas warehouses that were filled with Iranian weapons. And this was a moment for Sudan.
In the Gaza Strip or in Sudan?
In Sudan. So they flew all the way to, south of Egypt and did this on enemy turf. But it was that moment where the Sudanese kind of looked at each other and said, this Iran terrorism stuff, maybe it's not worth it. And you began to see changes that ultimately led to the toppling of a government by this Omar al-Bashir, who, by the way, also was a war criminal in Darfur. And ultimately, you saw the Sudanese government change from state sponsor of terrorism to an ally of the United States. And it happened it seemed like overnight, but it was a remarkable shift. But you get a sense of what it was like for this country to pay a price like that, to get bombed by one of the region's, elite militaries for providing military support to a terrorist organization. So the Israelis helped them change their mind. And that doesn't happen very often, but I certainly welcome it when it does happen in the region. And then you have Saudi Arabia, UAE, excuse me. UAE has always been kind of the number 2 power in the region. And they act on behalf of the Saudis to a certain extent. They're independent, but they're part of a larger bloc of Arab states. And I think they realized that there was an opening for them to work with the Israelis and to quietly share intelligence and to cooperate on technology, to work in cyber, all of the things that Israel can bring to the table. And so for years, it was an open secret. I mean, I've been to the UAE 3 or 4 times. Every time I did go, we would talk about Israel very openly. But, if you ask somebody at the UN, if they were from the UAE, what they thought about Israel, they'd say, well, we're voting against them tomorrow. It was, there was this weird thing that ultimately where the Emiratis realized they had to make a choice. There's that old Yiddish saying, with one tochus, you can't dance at two weddings. That was pretty much what happened with the UAE. They realized it was time to choose either Israel or anti-Israel. And I think they realized it was the right thing to do. And then with Bahrain, that is a country that has been suffering from Shiite militantism for a long time, that the Iranians have been using it's actually a majority Shiite population ruled by Sunnis. And so the Iranians have been trying to stir up the Shiite community to target the regime. And so it was not a surprise that they were anti-Iran and wanted to side with Israel. But you get a sense of how everybody was moving in the same direction all at once. But one important thing, and that is that the Palestinian file has been a mess for many years. So for all these countries that said that they opposed Israel because of the Palestinians, it soon became clear that the Palestinians can't choose a leader. They're completely corrupt. They are at war with one another between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. It is not easy to be a champion of the Palestinians these days. So you had these countries say, you know what, I'm going over there.
And for Saudi Arabia, do you see there being a tipping point anytime soon? What would it take?
I'm not sure they're there yet. I think that right now, I wrote a piece for Commentary Magazine last month where I think this administration is really giving the Saudis a hard time. It's open season on Saudi Arabia and Washington right now. America pulled its support for the Saudi war against the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis, by the way, embrace a lot of the same tactics as Hezbollah, Hamas, firing rockets into civilian areas. And the Saudis have tried to respond. They don't have the same kind of military capabilities as Israel. And so they've made a lot of mistakes in trying to fight that war and killing in terms of killing civilians and really taking a lot of heat from human rights groups. So America pulled its support there. We also delisted the Houthis as a terrorist organization for reasons that never really made a lot of sense to me, but it really angered the Saudis. And then also within a few weeks of the Biden administration taking office, they released, it wasn't even new intelligence. They recycled old intelligence that showed that Saudi Arabia was behind the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist who was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. I don't think anybody doubts that happened. I think the Saudis admit that it happened, but there's a sense that, among the progressive left in America, that the Saudis really need their comeuppance. And I think that as long as that's the case, I don't think Saudi Arabia is going to take a lot of risks. They will not feel like they're getting the support from the United States that they need. If anything, what you might see is you might see them start to flirt a little bit with the Chinese or the Russians, knowing that there's a great power competition. They might start to steer away from the United States, which I think would be a big mistake. I believe that right now, if we take advantage of the natural sentiment in the region, we have the possibility to engineer another peace deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And that will be a tipping point for really the rest of the Middle East. If Saudi Arabia can do it as the custodians of the two holy mosques, as the leaders of Islam in the Muslim world, or at least as they promote themselves to be, that is a tipping point. And that's what we should be working toward. Probably not a two-state solution. It's not to say that I don't want to see one, but I would say that right now there's a higher likelihood of a broader normalization wave across the region than there is for a two-state solution, primarily because right now the leadership of the Palestinian Authority is in total disarray. And there could come a time very soon where we could see even a change there as well. But I think there's some interesting opportunities if we focus on Saudi.
Jonathan, it's a brilliant analysis. I'd love to hear you to shift a little bit to stepping off of what you just said with this possibility, and how does the political change in Israel tonight, which has been secured, as you know, we now have the end of Netanyahu, so to speak, on that level. what opportunities, what is, what's the double-edged sword of that, and how do you see that? And given that change, given the sorts of things, what role do you see the United States being able to play in there? Because the Biden administration is, has hedged quite a bit at the beginning. We just have a new ambassador, Tom Nides, who will come there, who's got a long history of, from Goldman Sachs and the rebuilding, and is, a very reasonable and moderate voice and a get done sort of guy. What do you see all this pertaining, and how it affects relations, and how Iran and plays out with these new players in the region?
Yeah, well, let me try to tackle the Israel question first. I mean, let me just say this about Bibi. I know he's a controversial figure among Israel watchers, or among Israelis, or maybe among American politicians as well. But there are certain things you can't take away from him, especially over the last year. The guy guided Israel through the pandemic and made it a leader in terms of vaccination, in terms of containing the virus, treating the virus. Was able to guide the country through the financial hardships that accompany the virus, and in the process was able to sign 4 peace agreements. So, not too shabby for Netanyahu, right? And it's kind of remarkable that he's being voted out of office after a year like that. But, democracies are fickle things. And by the way, if the guy's been in power for 12 years, actually 14 total, democracies don't tend to like those either. There's like a sort of a sell-by date for politicians in any democracy. And I think that probably explains what's happened. And of course, the Israeli political system is like, mixed martial arts in terms of the brutality of the politicians. So, we expected this sort of thing to happen. Now, the thing that I don't... yeah. It's true. It's not for the faint of heart over there. But, so now we're at this moment where I think the Israelis are going to miss Bibi for 2 reasons primarily. They're going to miss him because he is an expert on the Iran nuclear deal, the flaws within it, the vulnerabilities of Iran. And by the way, this war between wars that I was describing, the shadow conflict, he has waged this war fearlessly. And I have to say, I give him full credit for holding Iran to account and not allowing the war to continue where Israel just keeps duking it out with Iran's puppets and not with Iran itself. And so I think he'll be missed on the Iran front, but he'll also be missed, and I think it's related, on the normalization front. These Arab states look to him as a strong leader, as someone that has been around almost as long as many of them have. Of course, they've been around because they are part of corrupt autocracies and monarchies. Bibi was just able to play the system for a very long time, and he became a trusted face. Whether the Supreme Court may eventually disagree with you, but that's another story. Okay, yeah, and let the Israeli Supreme Court work its magic. But we're now at a point where you have to wonder: will Naftali Bennett be embraced by the leadership of the UAE or Bahrain? Will Yair Lapid? By the way, I would actually argue that Bennett probably has more in common, believe it or not, Israel's right-wing religious prime minister in waiting right now. He probably has more in common with some of these religious types in the Gulf than Lapid, who is deeply secular and, probably just doesn't view things in the same light as the rest of the region. I see him as a much more westernized kind of politician. So it'll be very interesting to see how Israel weathers the normalization issue and the Iran issue with new leadership. The good news, by the way, is that a lot of the contacts that were taking place before the agreements were signed, and certainly after, have been on the intelligence level, in the military, and in the bureaucracy. So it means that there's a professionalization that has taken place that is not all of it hinges on 2 guys that have a bromance, right? You have something that's a little bit more complex. And the hope is that they built enough so that architecture can stand after the first floor is vacated.
What about the American policy? The Biden administration.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Biden administration is it's gonna be a weird couple of months, I think, for those that are watching Israel, because if you look at what just happened, the Biden administration gave Israel a green light for 9 days to really do what it needed to do in the Gaza Strip. Biden was terrific. Okay, now it got a little weird at the end because when the last 2 days of the conflict rolled around, and we knew that there was a ceasefire that Egypt had brokered. On day 9, that's when Biden started coming out and saying that he was talking tough to Bibi and he was telling him that this conflict has to end. Here's the thing, the conflict was going to end. We knew it. So that was a blank check for Bibi for Biden rather, to speak to his left flank, to speak to Bernie Sanders and AOC and some of the other politicians to the left of Biden that wanted to see him get tougher on Israel. So he had an opportunity to do it at no cost. By the way, Bibi did the same thing. He came out and told his right flank, I'm not going to end this war because someone tells me to do it. I'm going to end this war when Israel has defeated Hamas. Of course, everybody knew it was posturing on all sides, but you got a sense of what was going on here is that Biden has to deal with certain political realities in Washington, and some of those realities are anti-Israel realities. We sort of joke that there's a new, it's not a very large group of Congress people, but they are people that are whitewashing Hamas's role in the most recent conflict. I've been joking now that there's a Hamas caucus on Capitol Hill. And so Biden has to deal with that. And he also has to deal with the fact that there is an interest on the part of this particular group of legislators, as well as people in the executive branch who worked for Obama, that want to see the return of the nuclear deal. And when that happens, that will mean that billions of dollars will flow into the coffers of Iran, which means that it will probably be able to finance terrorism more widely. And here's the real irony, is the next conflict between Israel and Hamas will likely have been funded on both sides by the United States, right? Through the direct support that we give Israel, that is allocated every year through our MOU. That's the one side. And then the other side will be the indirect cash that comes through American sanctions relief via Iran and back to Hamas. And so there are going to be some discrepancies within American policy. You could have a pro-American president, or pro-Israel president rather, who is struggling with how to square these circles. And I can tell you it will be tricky days. I am not going to tell you that Biden's great. I'm also not going to tell you that he's terrible. I think he is a politician who's trying to navigate all of this, and it is not going to be easy, not for him, and certainly not for Israel.
Jonathan, you mentioned the next conflict with Hamas. I think Israelis, you talk to Israelis, I think there are many Israelis who are worried about what that next conflict with Hamas might be, not if, but when. And thinking more largely about the Iranian role in what that conflict might be. It seems also that a lot of Israelis are actually much more worried about what you mentioned earlier, which is a foreboding sense of inevitability with Hezbollah and what that conflict will be, God forbid, if that comes. And so I'm wondering if you can describe in more detail what a war with Hezbollah is going to look like, what Iran's objectives might be in that war, and what a likely outcome might be.
Sure. I mean, the first thing to note is just when you see Hamas fighting Israel, it's a practice round. It looks very scary, but they're not playing for keeps, neither side. Israel doesn't want to take over the Gaza Strip, and Hamas doesn't think it's ever going to destroy Israel. So they're both just throwing punches, and eventually this thing's going to end. There's no other, there's no other way. It's not going to end in a major decision. It's going to end in a tie, and you go back to mowing the lawn. This is the reality of the Gaza Strip. Now that may change with new weapons that are introduced to Gaza by Hamas, and we saw some of those weapons. By the way, we saw underwater unmanned vehicles, basically underwater drones that Israel destroyed. We saw air drones, UAVs. That also Israel destroyed, although one of them got through and destroyed Israel's gas pipeline in Ashkelon. It was a fairly significant strike that Israel has, I think, put a gag order on, because I've not seen any reporting since that took place. So you get a sense that it's a testing ground for a broader conflict. So that leads me to your question, Rabbi Miller, and that is, who are they testing for? They're testing for Hezbollah. Okay, Hezbollah has a much larger arsenal. Hezbollah has a larger army. Hezbollah has the ability to try to rush into Israel across the border. There isn't the sophisticated fence that you have the border around the Gaza Strip. They have drones. They have anti-tank weapons. They've got, they actually have something called PGMs, which is really the next scary thing to watch in this arena. PGMs are precision guided munitions. And we've had them here in the United States for more than 20 years. And it's what enables us, if we want to take out a terrorist in a building in Baghdad in the middle of the night without taking out the rest of the building, we can do it. And it's very, very precise, and you can actually modulate the weaponry itself so that it can have a large explosion, a small explosion, etc., but it's guided. And what Iran has been doing for the last several years is it has been smuggling PGMs or PGM parts into Lebanon. It may be able to circumvent Iron Dome. In other words, you can steer it. So you have a rocket going this way, and then Iron Dome's coming, well, then it can go here. And then the Iron Dome misses it, and it keeps going in the direction that it wants to go. And then more worryingly, it can hit a target within 5 or 10 yards of where it intended, which means that you could see Hezbollah try to hit the chemical plant in Haifa, or the Kiryat, the sort of Pentagon of Israel in Tel Aviv, or God forbid, Dimona, the nuclear reactor in Israel's south. If they can do that with precision and potentially overwhelm Iron Dome, this is what they're going for. But they're using Hamas to learn how Israel responds with Iron Dome and how it responds in certain military scenarios. But like I said, this was a test run. As scary as it seems, they're preparing for a much different conflict, a potentially uglier one in the north.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. That is terrifying, and we pray that that time never comes. We also want to take some time, seeing that it's 9 o'clock, to open up the floor. And Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for answering Rabbi Lustig and my questions. And we probably have more because that's who we are. But I know there have been a number of questions that have been asked in the chat, and that there might be a number of questions that those who have not written in the chat have. I want to go back maybe to get our questions started. Sandy asked an interesting question about, I'm going to summarize, Sandy, if that's okay, but as a part of the coalition agreement between Bennett and Lapid and what that looks like, what policy possibilities are on the table for Israel, and what have been taken off the table? Sandy mentioned further annexation and what that might look like.
It's a really good question. My sense is that this government is going to focus on domestic issues. After the pandemic, with economic challenges, I would say, I mean, Israel came out okay, but every country is going to have to rebuild after what we all just endured. So I'm saying that in past tense out of a pure sense of optimism. But I think that they're going to be focusing on budgets, on the economy, on social issues. I don't see significant foreign policy actions being taken. I think there will be a healthy tension about issues relating to the Palestinian territories, because you're going to have Bennett on the one side with a couple of other right-wing politicians as well, but then you have Meretz and Labor and Ram, an Islamist party that are going to be against such moves. So there will be some real tensions. Look, I will tell you that in general, in anything other than the military realm, I think that those tensions are positive in Israel. I'd like to see Israel be able to move quickly and boldly when it comes to military action. If they see a challenge mounting, you want them to be able to act quickly. But on everything else, given all of the sensitivities and tensions in the region, maybe sitting still for a little bit and putting your own house in order may not be the worst thing in the world. And so it's for that reason I'm fairly, sanguine about the prospects of this government. Not that I think it's going to hold together for a particularly long time, but I don't think it's a bad thing for multiple coalitions in Israel to try to find common ground. I think that's a positive at the end of the day.
Thank you. Thank you. And I can continue asking questions, although I know that a number of you have questions of your own. I'll invite anyone who wants to ask to feel free to unmute themselves and to do so. While we're waiting for our other questions to come in, if I could ask, when you think about getting the house in order, when you think about Israel having a functioning government, the extent to which you can say such a thing in this current arrangement, what policies internally do you see changing? We have questions about recognition of non-Orthodox marriage, military service for the Orthodox. I think the Orthodox is quite a large question now that their role has shifted in internal Israeli politics. So what do you see being the future of some of these internal policies, shifting or not?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say that, if you look at, for example, you've got Avigdor Lieberman, who's going to be part of this government, and he's a representative of the Russian community, and there are going to be needs that they are going to want to bring to the table. There will be needs brought to the table by the Arab community.
By the way, can you give some of those? I mean, it's fascinating when we think about, it's not when we think about Avigdor Lieberman and some of the right-wing religious settlers, we might, as Americans, group them together, but they're actually, as religious and non-religious, fundamentally different. Can you talk about some of those internal tensions?
Yeah, I mean, look, you have, the biggest tension right now, I think, probably surrounds the fact that Yair Lapid and his father, Tommy Lapid, who was a formidable politician before him, Holocaust survivor from Hungary. By the way, if you ever want to read a little bit more about Yair Lapid and where he comes from, there's a terrific book called Dreams of My Father that he wrote about his own father's Holocaust journey and coming to Israel and what it was like growing up. It's a tremendous book and really important for a guy that could be prime minister in 2 years. So I highly recommend it. But he's been a major proponent of not allowing the Orthodox to skip their military service. And that's been a significant social issue that I think is going to come out during this government if it holds. And I can imagine that there could be an interesting debate. Now, I also think that given the number of players that are involved, maybe you find that there's national service that is substituted for military service or something else. But it's those sorts of compromises that I think will be really interesting. You'll see, the Russian community, I would say, is aging at this point, right? You haven't seen new waves of Russian immigrants coming in. We had big waves in the 80s and 90s, and now they're a bit older, and so they're going to have different needs, and it's going to be more social and medical needs as opposed to some of the needs that they had before. And by the way, I would also argue that Avigdor Lieberman himself has a shelf life as a politician, as his Russian immigrants now see themselves primarily as Israelis, except for the older generation that still speaks Russian at home, right? So you kind of see some interesting changes there. Labor is going to reinvent itself. Labor has been dead for 2 decades because the Oslo process failed, same as Meretz, the left-wing party in Israel. They are going to have to figure out what it is that they're fighting for if the two-state solution is not on the table. And now they actually have a role to play for the first time in 12 years in an Israeli government. It will be interesting to see. So you just get a sense of I don't know, maybe they'll be talking about lower taxes or they'll be talking about more subsidies for universities. But these are the sorts of things that have not been part of the picture for a long time. So new constituencies will allow themselves to be heard in this new government, again, assuming it holds. And that's a big if, because I am not sure yet that it will. I think Bibi's still got tricks up his sleeve. And I also know that, this is like, the old joke of you put 2 Jews or 2 Israelis in a room and you get 10 opinions. You got, 7 people in a room, 7 parties that just signed this agreement. That's going to be like 70 opinions. So who knows where that's going to go.
Like the
it's
Sanhedrin.
right, right. It's like the Sanhedrin, like the original Sanhedrin. If you go back in Israeli politics, this was another question I was given. If you go back in Israeli politics, there have been deals made for alternating prime premierships that have not come to fruition. People are blaming Bibi's political style on at least some people are for them not coming to be. But do you imagine the rotation coming to bear? Assuming that the coalition doesn't fall apart.
Look, I think there is a real desire for the first 2 years to go as planned. I think Lapid will push for it. I think others will as well, as long as Bennett does not overreach and pursue a right-wing agenda beyond what was initially discussed. And so that will be interesting. I think a bigger question is, if Lapid takes over, will Bennett and Shaked and others, will they play fair? And I'm not sure they will, but I have to tell you, I don't think that that's really the issue for Lapid. Lapid was a heat-seeking missile for the last, I don't know how many years. All he wanted to do was to torpedo Netanyahu's office tenure. He wanted it done. It was personal for him. And I'm not saying that this was petty, because I don't think it was. I think Lapid truly did not like where the government of Israel was heading under Netanyahu. And the longer it lasted, the more he felt that he needed to do whatever it took. And so you see this guy come out and say, I'm going to allow a person who I fundamentally disagree with 180 degrees from just about every position that I take, I will let him be prime minister first, as long as Bibi goes. And that's just what happened. And I think that is really one of the most remarkable storylines out of all of this. I don't know if he will be given enough credit in the Western media. In Israel, I think everybody sees what he did, and it was historic by that alone.
Wow. I mean, that's a terrific analysis, right? And how that will play out for Lapid's career moving forward. I also want to introduce you to somebody, Jonathan, who you may have seen also on Al Jazeera and other news sources that you've presented on. Our very own Edward Joseph, has a question for you. So I'd like to spotlight him. Terrific. Edward, hello.
Thank you, Rabbi Miller. And Jonathan, it's been great to listen to you, and forgive me, I had to tune in late, so I apologize if you've addressed this. It comes to really the crux of it for us as American Jews and our support of Israel in relation to this eternal question of the Palestinians. And Jonathan, you may not agree, but many people say the takeaway from this recent Gaza-Israel conflict was that the Palestinians are still there. In other words, you can do all the Abraham Accords and so forth, but you cannot sidestep this issue. The Palestinians are there. Obviously, Hamas can manipulate and act at will. Anytime there's tension in Al-Aqsa, anywhere they can strike, and they have that ability at will to manipulate that. And until this issue is addressed, Israel is at a disadvantage, and we see that playing out politically. And so my question for you, Jonathan, is, I'm sure everyone's familiar with all the obstacles to a deal, but what is your vision, your own personal vision? How do you see a settlement here? Again, let's forget about Abbas and Hamas and all the difficulties, but is it possible to have a two-state solution if Israel is continuing to build settlements, which to me are sort of the crux, the deal breaker, as an American Jew, where I can see that this is wrong, this is destructive in a way of Israel's security. So that's my question for you, Jonathan. If you could.
No, it's a good question. I'm happy to answer it. So I think to understand where I come from, and I will do a shameless plug. I highly recommend, if you really want to know where I come out on this, I wrote a book called Hamas versus Fatah: The Struggle for Palestine. It's on Amazon, and it's very affordable from what I hear. But at any rate, in that book, I wrote about the divisions that exist within Palestinian society. And the fact that since 2007, we've had two different governments, one in the West Bank, one in Gaza. You have Hamasistan and you've got West Bankistan. And the two sides can't agree on the color of hummus right now. And they haven't been able to for 14 years. That makes a two-state solution exceedingly, exceedingly difficult. So my first serious recommendation, which by the way, no administration has wanted to hear about since 2007. And I can tell you, I walked into the State Department when it was the Bush years, and then when it was in the Obama years and the Trump years. I haven't had my conversation yet with the Biden folks, but I promise you I will. And I keep saying, what are you going to do about the divisions? Because without solving those divisions, you have a three-state solution, right? There was a war that took place in 2007 where Hamas took over by force, killed Palestinian Authority officers, pushed people to their deaths from tall buildings, shot them in the legs and arms. They have been at war ever since. Sometimes it's a hot war, sometimes it's a cold war, but they hate each other. If you can't solve that, you're not getting to a two-state solution, and the Israelis will never budge. So right now, there is a really interesting thing that's happening where the Egyptians are trying to broker agreements, okay? They're trying to broker a prisoner swap between Israel and Hamas. They're trying to broker a more permanent ceasefire so that Hamas can rebuild in Gaza. And then they're also trying to broker reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah so that real elections can be held and so that there can be a unified leader that will be respected across the Palestinian divide, and then eventually allow Israel to start to think about West Bank and Gaza Strip combined, okay? They have not been able to do that since 2007. And really, to talk about a two-state solution while that is going on it's disingenuous for those who know what they're saying, or it's fanciful for those who don't. And this is, I think, the core component right now of we know that Israel will continue to elect leaders, and those leaders will have to continue to grapple with the two-state solution. But if they don't know who to talk to, we have a real problem. And this is, to me, the key to moving everything forward. From there, look, there will be disagreements about what settlements are movable and which settlements are not. What the border should look like. Should it be where it is or should it shouldn't? What should they do about, the people claiming refugee status? All those things are negotiable, as we've seen at least twice in the last 20 years. And Israel is willing to make those kinds of compromises and sacrifices if there is a partner. But there hasn't been one for a very long time. So settlements, yeah, sure, they can be a problem. By the way, I don't consider every settlement to be a problem, but let's just say that 40% of the settlements are really bad for peace. There's no one to talk to about it right now. And that's a huge problem. And I'm hoping that that changes first, and then we can start to rebuild towards something bigger.
Please, may it be so. Jonathan, I want to be sensitive to our time, and I notice it's 9:15. With these seemingly intractable problems with Iran's regional aspirations and religious aspirations, with Hamas as this constant source of angst, to say the least, with Israel, with a looming war on its northern border, with a refugee crisis on the other side of the river. What gives you hope? Right? Maybe we should end here. What's the shining star that, and if there is one, right, that you were looking ahead and saying maybe there's a possibility here? And
yeah,
I think we should begin.
I'll give you a couple things that I look for right now that I think are exciting. One is that sometime soon, I don't know when, there will be a new leader in the Palestinian Authority. Mahmoud Abbas is 16 years into a 4-year term, and he's not in great health. He won't name a vice president or a successor. And so what we have in the West Bank is, it's a classic Arab autocrat. And he's not interested in allowing for really hope to creep into the West Bank in any real way for freedom of thought, freedom of political activity. It's been a nightmare, I think, for the West Bank. And I think the Palestinians are a smart, educated community that have been exposed in the diaspora to the United States, to democracies, to Western economies, free market economies. they know how to run a country. And the question is, will they find leaders who will let them? Arafat didn't, and Abbas didn't. So the question is, who comes next? I think there is reason for hope there. I do. I'll be curious to see how that selection process goes, and I hope it's orderly. But if it is, we could see the rise of a new generation of leadership, a younger generation, and one that will be willing to hopefully compromise as well. That's one. Number two is Saudi Arabia. We talked about it. The fear of Iran looms large in the Arab world. These countries see Israel as, I think, an ally, or at least, someone to be in the trenches with. And I think the Israelis have huge opportunities to expand the scope of normalization. And again, if the Saudis take that step, then man, the sky's the limit. I think the whole Muslim world, from Malaysia and Indonesia to Mali and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, can go as well. And that would be really a remarkable moment in the Middle East. I'm not sure that that's where we are now, but with a bit more work and effort, who knows? The last thing is what Israel is able to do with the technology that it has. Simply remarkable. I don't know if you saw, there was an article that described how Israel was able to locate and target individuals that were fighting on behalf of Hamas through artificial intelligence. They are able to destroy an Iranian nuclear facility with cyber weapons. They are able to do these things that I think, we could only dream of some time ago. Now just imagine the region reaches a more peaceful place. Maybe there's a new regime in Iran. Maybe some of these other Arab states have decided to normalize. You get a sense, maybe the two-state solution, kickstarts again. Imagine what Israel can do if it doesn't apply those technologies to weaponry. Imagine what that can do. We've already seen a little bit of it in terms of the way that Israel has helped with agriculture and water and medicine, even COVID developments. But the technology coming out of this tiny country continues to amaze me. And it is for that reason that I have incredible hope for the future of the region, because even with the small amount of work that they've done in areas outside of the military realm, it's nothing short of remarkable.
So, Jonathan, I want to thank you. I want to thank Rabbi Miller. And I also want to thank, we've had in registration of this way past the 800, almost 1,000 people that have been interested. I want to thank you. And this was we wanted to put you as the anchor on this because unfortunately, you're brilliant in what you're doing, but unfortunately your subject matter would not change much no matter what the outcome of those were, which is an unfortunate situation. But we're very blessed that we have your smarts and your ability to do this. To Rabbi Miller, who helped organize this, to Shira, who did this, and mostly to all of you who have a constant and a critical interest in making the world a better place and understanding in order to, as good Reformed Jews, that we want to know before we choose, before we think, before we do. And Jonathan, we thank you for that. We wish all of you a great summer. We have a number of programs we hope that you'll participate in. There's a program, Eat, Love, and Pray, that's going to be on Monday nights, I believe, correct, Rabbi? That's coming up, and a number of things. We hope that you'll pay heed to those. We wish that a new day is coming, and we'll all remember years from now that on the edge of a new democracy and a new Middle East, that we were able to have an evening with somebody who's been struggling to understand it and give us insight for a long time. Jonathan, thank you so much. Rabbi Miller, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, have a good evening, and we wish all of you a great summer. We look forward to, after July 4th, we're going to be having we begin to go live again and see each other in person at Washington Hebrew. We want to remind you, if you haven't registered already, that on June 6th, this coming Sunday evening, is a fabulous annual meeting that's not to be missed. and I hope that you will join in that. Ladies and gentlemen, Erev Tov. Good night.